Fiona Greer had the kind of stillness that made people uncomfortable without knowing why. She wasn't cold exactly. She spoke when spoken to, smiled when smiling was appropriate, and had the particular patience of someone who had learned long ago that most situations, if you waited them out, resolved themselves without requiring you to raise your voice. She had arrived at Ridgecrest Memorial Hospital on a Wednesday in early October carrying a backpack, a stainless steel travel mug, and a reference letter from a nursing coordinator in Petawawa that nobody at Ridgecrest had bothered to call and verify. She had introduced herself to the charge desk as a new ER nurse, transferred from a rural trauma posting, and had been handed a lanyard and a locker key, and pointed toward the staff room without ceremony. Nobody asked too many questions. They were short-staffed as they always were, and Fiona Greer was a warm body with credentials. And it became clear within her first shift, a steadiness under pressure that the veteran nurses noticed immediately. Even if they couldn't name exactly what they were seeing, the ER at Ridgecrest served a corridor of North Edmonton that had been promised revitalization for 3 consecutive civic administrations and received none of it. The hospital itself was a mid-century building that had been extended twice and renovated in sections, so that the emergency department occupied a wing that always smelled faintly of old concrete, regardless of how much industrial cleaner the housekeeping staff used. It was the kind of place where the waiting room chairs were bolted to the floor, not because administration had ordered it, but because experience had made it necessary. On a good night, it was controlled chaos. On a bad night, it was something else. Fiona had been there 2 weeks when the other nurses started exchanging looks. It wasn't any single thing. It was the accumulation of small moments that didn't add up to the profile of a nurse who had spent the previous 5 years at a rural posting in northern Ontario. Which was what her file said. It was the way she assessed a trauma patient in under 60 seconds. Her eyes moving in a sequence that wasn't the standard triage protocol, but was somehow faster and more complete. It was the way she positioned herself in a room, when she didn't know what was coming through the door. Wait. Low back to a wall, sight lines clear. In a way that had nothing to do with nursing and everything to do with something older. It was the way she carried herself in the supply corridor, at 2 in the morning, when the rest of the night shift was running on caffeine and anxiety. And Fiona moved through it like she had somewhere to be. And no particular worry about getting there. Nurse manager Deborah Hartley noticed. She filed it away, the way experienced managers file things that don't fit neatly into any existing category. Quietly without conclusion watching. Dr. Vincent Arcand noticed too, and he drew entirely different conclusions. Arcand was the head of emergency medicine at Ridgecrest, which he treated less like a role than like a property he had acquired through decades of effort. And had no intention of sharing. He was in his late 50s, tall in the way that certain men are, who have been told their height is an asset, with a manner that had been polished over years of departmental politics into something that resembled authority without quite achieving it. He had trained at the University of Toronto, had published moderately in a journal that no longer existed, and had returned to Edmonton because return to Edmonton, he had once said, was his choice rather than his circumstance. Whether he believed this was unclear. What was clear was that he ran his department with the particular brand of control that comes not from being the most competent person in the room, but from ensuring that nobody else gets comfortable enough to demonstrate that they might be. He decided about Fiona Greer within days, that she was a problem he hadn't yet categorized. It began the way it always begins with men like Arcand. Small corrections delivered in front of others. A comment about her charting format during handover. A remark about her positioning during a resuscitation that was technically accurate, but wholly unnecessary since the patient was stabilizing before he opened his mouth. He overrode 2 of her triage assessments in the first week, reassigning patients she had flagged as high priority to lower acuity bays. Both patients were eventually escalated. He moved on without comment. The way men like him always move on. Not because they don't notice, but because noticing would require acknowledgement. He introduced her to a visiting administrator. As one of our newer additions, still finding her footing, which made the 3 nurses standing behind the administrator's shoulder look at the floor. Fiona said nothing. She adjusted her lanyard, nodded and went back to the board. She had spent 8 years as a Canadian Forces medical technician. A med tech, in the language of the military, Attached to a special operations task force that operated under protocols, she was still legally prohibited from discussing in any specific detail. She had deployed twice to Mali and once to a location that appeared in no public record she had ever seen. She had run trauma care in the field with equipment that would make the Ridgecrest supply room look overstocked. By comparison, in conditions that the physicians she now worked under would find medically inconceivable, she had kept a man alive for 40 minutes, with 2 chest seals and a tourniquet improvised from a rifle sling, while waiting for a helicopter that was coming from further away than helicopters should have to come from. She had been decorated. She had been debriefed. She had been encouraged to remain and had chosen not to. She had come back to Edmonton because her mother was there. And because she had grown tired, she told herself of a particular quality of silence that she associated with certain kinds of waiting. She had taken her nursing credentials, which the military training had mostly covered, and had looked for a hospital that needed people badly enough not to ask too many questions. And Ridgecrest Memorial had presented itself in that capacity within 48 hours of her search. Nobody here knew any of this. She preferred it that way. On the morning of her 3rd week, Dr. Arkan crossed a line that even the nurses who had come to expect the worst from him found difficult to rationalize. A man came in by ambulance presenting with what the paramedics were calling a suspected MI. Chest pain radiating to the jaw, diaphoresis, the whole picture. The paramedics had done their work correctly. Fiona took the handover, did her own rapid assessment, and added one piece of information to the chart that the paramedics hadn't clocked. The patient's neck veins were elevated, the heart sounds were muffled, and the blood pressure had dropped 12 points since the ambulance had left the scene. She flagged it as a possible cardiac tamponade. Fluid around the heart, building pressure, a condition that could kill within minutes and that would not respond to the MI protocol currently being ordered. Arkan reviewed the chart at the nursing station, looked at Fiona's addition and looked at Fiona. Beck's triad, he said, in the tone of a man explaining something to someone who had mentioned the word triangle without knowing what geometry was, requires confirmed assessment by a physician. You're documenting a differential diagnosis, which is outside your scope of practice. I'll determine what this presentation indicates. He ordered the MI protocol to proceed. Fiona stood at the nursing station for a moment, the kind of moment that is very quiet on the outside. Then she followed the patient into Bay 3 and continued her own monitoring. When the patient's pressure dropped further, and his JVP climbed, and the rhythm on the monitor shifted, in a way that confirmed what she already knew, she called the code. She called it clearly, correctly, and loudly enough that the attending resident came running, and took one look at the patient, and called for an emergency pericardiocentesis. The patient's survived Arkan arrived in Bay 3 4 minutes after the code was called. He took in the scene. He looked at the resident who looked at the wall. He looked at Fiona. You escalated without physician direction, he said. That is a formal performance matter. I will be speaking to the CNO this afternoon, and I expect a written account from you of every decision you made in that bay. From the moment the paramedics handed over, Fiona looked at him with the same flat attention she had once used to receive orders she disagreed with from people who were about to find out they were wrong. The patient's heart isn't in tamponade anymore, she said, and she went back to the board. Deborah Hartley, who had been standing in the doorway of the medication room and had heard the entire exchange, looked down at her clipboard for a long moment, and then wrote something on it that she did not share with anyone. The call came in at 17:23, during the overlap between day and evening shifts, when the department was at its most porous. Too many people handing things off to other people. Too much noise, too much lateral movement to easily track any one thread. The trash desk received it first. A report from security that a group of men had been seen entering the hospital from the parkade-level entrance on the east side. The entrance that technically required a keycard after 5 p.m., but whose reader had been malfunctioning for 11 days. The security guard, who called it in, said there were 4 of them, that they moved like they weren't visiting anyone, and that one of them had said something to him that he didn't want to repeat over the radio. By the time the call reached the charge desk, the men were already in the main corridor. There were 4 of them. The first was wide through the shoulders, wearing a gray jacket with the hood up, despite the warmth, scanning the bay numbers as he walked. with the methodical patience of someone following a list. The second was younger, moving fast. His right hand held at his hip, in a way that Fiona understood, before she consciously processed the reason. The third and fourth came in behind, spreading to the left and right, as they passed the nurse's station, positioning themselves at the two main exit points, with an efficiency that had been practiced. Fiona was standing at the medication cart when they came in. She did not freeze. She did not reach for anything. She set down the blister pack she was holding, and straightened and looked at the room. With eyes that had once been trained to assess a space in under 5 seconds for threats, resources, cover and options. She counted 4 men, 3 visible weapons, the shape of 2 underjackets, one partially visible at the hip of the youngest one who hadn't yet learned that carrying outside a waistband telegraphs badly. She counted 14 staff in the immediate area, 7 patients in bays, 2 of whom were ambulatory, 1 exit clear through the medication corridor. If she moved in the next 90 seconds, 1 through the ambulance bay, blocked by the second man. The security door to radiology was on a delay sensor. It would open on badge or on manual override from inside, which she knew because she had already memorized the floor plan. The way she memorized all floor plans out of habit during her first week. The leader, the wide one with the hood, stopped in the middle of the department and spoke in a voice that was calibrated to reach every corner without quite becoming a shout. He said they were not there for the staff and they were not there for the patients. He said they were there for a specific individual who had been admitted that afternoon with a gunshot wound. A man named something that Fiona didn't catch and didn't need to. He said that anyone who reached for a phone or moved toward an exit would make his evening considerably more complicated, and that he preferred simple evenings. Behind the nurse's station, Fiona heard someone draw a sharp breath. She heard a chair roll back on its wheels and stop. She looked at Deborah Hartley, who was 6 feet away and had gone very pale. She looked at the resident, a third year named Ford, who was standing absolutely still in the way that people stand still when their body has made a decision before their brain has caught up to it. She looked at Dr. Arkand, who had emerged from the physician workroom at the sound of the voice, and who was now standing near the corridor junction, with both hands flat at his sides, and an expression Fiona had never seen on his face before. Not the managed authority, not the practiced dismissal, something rawer and smaller. She kept her own face neutral. She kept her hands where they could be seen. She began to move, not fast, not in any way that announced itself. She moved like a person finding a better place to stand, angling herself away from the medication cart and toward the center of the room, where the sight lines opened up, and where she was closer to the bay corridor, and to the youngest man with the visible weapon, and to the gap between the second man and the ambulance bay entrance that had been almost closed but not quite. The leader's eyes found her. He studied her for a moment with the particular calculation of someone who has spent time in rooms where the wrong person acts first. "Stay where you are," he said. She stopped. She put her hands slightly out from her sides. "I hear you," she said in the voice she had once used to speak to a village elder through an interpreter, while a situation 3 compounds over was getting worse by the minute. Low even, no sharp edges. "We're not going to make this complicated. The person you're looking for is in Bay 9. I can take you there." The leader looked at her. He had been expecting several responses to his entry, and this was not among them. The fact that she hadn't flinched, hadn't deferred exactly, hadn't pulled out a phone, but had simply stood there and talked to him, like they were 2 people negotiating something reasonable. It introduced a variable he hadn't accounted for. He took a step toward her. "You want to walk me to Bay 9, he said. "Not a question." "I want to keep my staff from getting hurt," she said. "Bay 9 is down the corridor, 40 seconds. She watched his face. She watched his right hand. She watched the youngest one who had drifted a half step away from his position near the east exit. Because he was 22, and found the waiting harder than the action, and because 22-year-olds in rooms with guns almost always show you what they're going to do before they do it. He showed her. His right hand moved. And the moment it did, Fiona moved, and the sequence that followed lasted, according to the security footage that was reviewed afterward by 2 separate investigators, approximately 83 seconds. She came off her heel and closed the distance to the youngest one in 2 steps, using his forward momentum against the direction he was trying to stop it. And the weapon went down and his wrist went with it at an angle that produced a sound she recognized. and that he would remember for a long time. She used the wall to redirect herself toward the second man, who had started moving away from the ambulance bay door. Exactly the wrong decision, because it took him away from the only thing in the room he controlled, and put him in open space, which was where she wanted him. The second man was bigger than the youngest one and more experienced. But experience only helps when you've seen what's coming. And he hadn't seen this, and by the time he adjusted for what he thought was happening, she was already doing something else, and his weapon was on the floor, and he was on his knees, and there was a locked joint in his shoulder that gave him no useful options. The leader charged toward her, and she read it before he fully committed. She didn't meet him directly. She pulled the crash cart between them with her left hand, and went around the right side, and when they came together, it was not where he had planned, and not on the terms he had planned, and he was large and capable, and had done this before. But she was faster and had done it in worse conditions, and she knew from the first contact exactly how it was going to end. He went down against the nurse's station, with a sound that rattled the monitor on top of it. His weapon had not fired. Hers had not existed. She held his wrist in a lock against the floor, and looked across the room. The fourth man, the one at the east exit, had not moved during any of this. He was standing exactly where he had positioned himself watching. He was the oldest of the four and the most careful, and careful men in rooms where things have gone wrong very quickly tend to make one of two decisions. He looked at his three associates, one on the floor near the corridor, one on his knees against the wall, one face down under a nurse's arm, and he looked at Fiona, and Fiona looked back at him with an expression that communicated, without hostility and without drama, that he had already run the calculation and they both already knew the answer. He put the weapon on the floor. He put his hands behind his head without being asked. The room was very quiet, the monitors beeped. Somewhere in the waiting area, a child was crying and then stopped. Fiona straightened. Her breathing was slightly elevated. She looked around the room. A sweep she ran automatically, cataloging what had changed and what still needed addressing. And then she walked to the kitchen and picked up the emergency handset and called security, and gave them a precise, efficient account of what was in the department, and what its status was, and what she needed in the next 4 minutes, using language and a communication structure that made the security guard on the other end pause for a moment before he responded. She set the handset down. The staff were where she had last seen them, most of them. Deborah Hartley was still standing near the medication room door. The resident Ford had his back against the wall and was looking at the floor of the corridor. And it took Fiona a moment to realize he was doing square breathing, which meant someone had taught him something useful. 3 of the nurses had moved patients back from the open bays during the sequence Lee hadn't directed, and which was the right call. And she noted it. She looked at Dr. Arcand. He was standing where she had last seen him near the corridor junction. He had not moved during any of it. He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before, and couldn't immediately categorize. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't quite recognition. It was something more difficult than both of those. The particular look of someone encountering late information that reorganizes things they had assumed were settled. He said nothing. She went to Bay 3 and checked on the cardiac patient, whose monitors had remained stable throughout, and then she went to Bay 7 and checked on an elderly woman whose IV line had pulled partially loose during the commotion, and she reset it, and she asked the woman in a quiet voice if she needed anything, and the woman said she would like some water. When someone had a chance, and Fiona got her the water. Edmonton Police Service arrived at 1747, 2 patrol cars and a supervisor's vehicle. And they came through the ambulance bay entrance, with weapons drawn, and found a department that was considerably more orderly than the call had suggested it might be. 4 individuals secured, 2 with improvised restraints from the trauma supply cabinet, 2 who had not needed restraining, because restraining them had in one case already happened and in the other not seemed necessary. 11 staff members present and unharmed, every patient in their assigned space. The patrol supervisor, a staff sergeant named Ouellet, who had been on the job long enough that almost nothing surprised him, walked through the department doing his own assessment and eventually arrived at Fiona, who was at the board updating a chart. He stood beside her for a moment. "You're the one who called it in," he said. "Charge desk called the silent alarm," she said. "I called it in after." The restraints, he said. Trauma supply cabinet, she said. There's a protocol. The 4 individuals, he said. She wrote something on the chart. They came in, she said. The situation resolved. Staff Sergeant Ouellette looked at her for a moment longer than he needed to, if he had just wanted information. Then he looked at the 4 men, 2 of whom were conscious and had the particular quality of stillness that comes from having been physically outmatched by someone you hadn't expected and not yet having processed it. Is there something you want to tell me about your background? He said. I'm a nurse, she said. 3rd week. He looked at her steadily. She looked at the board. Right, he said. The report that crossed the desk of Ridgecrest Memorial's chief of staff 3 days later had been compiled from the security footage, the police report, 5 staff witness accounts, and a file request that had been initiated by a phone call from a number that was not in the hospital's contact directory. And that the administrative assistant, who took the call, described afterward as very official sounding, though she could not specify exactly why. The chief of staff, Dr. Annette Boudreau, read the file twice. She was a careful person. She had been running Ridgecrest for 9 years, in the particular way that administrators run underfunded urban hospitals, with complete awareness of the gap between what the institution could provide and what its patients needed, and a commitment to closing that gap by whatever incremental measure was available to her. This fiscal quarter. She called Fiona into her office on a Thursday afternoon. It was a small office, practical, with one photograph on the wall of a lake, somewhere in northern Quebec, that Boudreau had grown up near, and which she kept visible, not as decor, but as a specific kind of reminder. She gestured toward the chair across from her desk, and waited until Fiona sat before she opened the folder. I'm going to tell you what I know, Boudreau said. And you can tell me as much or as little as you feel's appropriate, and we'll work from there. Fiona looked at the folder. She said nothing. Your CF record is substantially redacted, Boudreau said. What I can see is 8 years of service, the last 4 of which are attached to a task force designation. I don't have clearance to look up. I see a list of commendations that is longer than any CF medical technician file I've encountered, and I've encountered a few through our hiring pipeline. I see a transition date of about 14 months ago, and a note that says clinical nursing credentials were completed concurrent with the last 18 months of service, which is not standard. She paused. I see someone who came here presenting as a starting level ER nurse, and who, in 3 weeks, has demonstrated a clinical judgment profile that I would normally associate with a 10-year staff member, and who 3 days ago managed a 4-person armed incursion in a manner that the police report describes as, and I'm quoting here, remarkably controlled. Fiona sat with her hands in her lap. The patients were at risk, she said. The staff were at risk. The situation needed to be managed. It did, Boudreau said. It was. She closed the folder. I want to offer you a position. Clinical lead for emergency nursing. A role that coordinates triage protocol, manages the nursing team's clinical standards, and has a direct line into physician decision-making on complex presentations. She let that sit for a moment. It's a role we haven't filled since our last lead left for Toronto in June. It normally carries a 5 to 7 year seniority expectation. Fiona looked at the desk. Then she looked at the photograph of the lake. There are triage protocols here that need updating, she said. The current system is triaging to acuity without accounting for trajectory. I've seen 2 patients in 3 weeks who were correctly categorized on presentation, but whose acuity changed within the assessment window, and were still in a queue when they shouldn't have been. I know, Boudreau said. If I take the role, Fiona said, I need to be able to revise the protocols. Not recommend revision, actually revise them. Yes, Boudreau said. Fiona looked at the folder. And Dr. Arcand, she said. Boudreau looked at her. What about him, she said. I'm not asking you to do anything about Dr. Arcand, Fiona said. With the particular precision of someone choosing words the way you choose a path through terrain you've already surveyed. I'm saying that if the protocols change, they need to be followed. By everyone. A silence settled over the office that was not exactly comfortable, and was not exactly uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that exists between 2 people who are each assessing the other and both finding the assessment more interesting than they expected. Understood, Boudreau said. Fiona looked at the offer on the desk. She did not touch it. I'll take it, she said. She stood up, adjusting the lanyard that still had her original name badge on it, the one from her first day. Is the Thursday shift covered or do you need me to go back to the floor? Boudreaux blinked once, which for her constituted a visible response. The shift is covered, she said. Okay, Fiona said. And she walked out of the office and down the corridor. And back to the emergency department, where there were 3 patients waiting for assessments and a 4th, who had just arrived by ambulance with a presentation she could see from across the room needed to be seen before the other 3. She picked up the chart, she read it. She began. Dr. Arkin passed the nursing station twice that evening without stopping. On the 3rd pass he paused. He stood with his hands in the pockets of his coat and looked at the board for a moment. The way someone looks at something familiar that has become, without warning, slightly different. He did not say anything to Fiona. She did not expect him to. She updated the board, checked the time, and moved to the next bay with the unhurried certainty of someone who has been here before. Not in this building. Not under these fluorescent lights. Not with this particular weight of institutional history pressing in through the walls. But here, in the specific quality of work that does not pause and does not perform and does not require an audience to proceed. She had somewhere to be. She had no particular worry about getting there.